Okay, so we're going to look at some different moods today. So I'm going to explain what that is. We'll do the usual grammar check in English so we understand what it is that that means. And then we're going to look specifically at something known as the imperative tense, which is to do with commands or requests. And hopefully we'll be able to do a little bit of Bible translation. I think we'll have a go at that and illustrate a couple of points as a result of it. So I want to just look at a couple of verses with you alongside the usual exercises. So the first thing to look at then is we better just think about what we mean by moods and what do we mean in terms of the imperative. So do we understand that from an English perspective? So if we just take a little look at this table here, so let's talk a little bit time going through the English so we kind of understand what it is we're looking at and perhaps also what we've already looked at so far. So a mood in terms of language indicates the manner in which the action of the verb is to be considered, right? Which maybe sounds just as confusing. But what we have looked at so far is something which is known as the indicative mood, okay? And when we've looked at anything that just gives a statement or raises a question, then that's in the indicative. Now, it may well be in the past tense, it may be in the future tense, it may be in the present tense. Okay, all of those are considered to be in something known as the indicative. Now, we haven't really talked in that terms, but we're going to categorize them like that now. So, for example, I am teaching, which is in the present tense. Were you teaching, which should have been a question with its question mark on it. She will be teaching, future, can I teach? Or if I put you were teaching. So anything like anything that just is a statement, a question that's being raised, something along those lines is known as the indicative case. But that's not the only way in which we express language. There are a number of other types of use in language, and they come under a different mood. Okay, so there's another mood which is known as the imperative, and the imperative, if you understand the word, suggests a command, okay, or an exhortation, a plea, a request. Now, it's quite important to understand this. What we're going to look at today covers a broad spectrum of what we mean by the imperative mood. So we might talk about commanding somebody to do something and it must be done. But the use of the imperative is it is broader than that, in as it will go for sort of more just requests to do something or exhortations to do things. So when we look at the imperative tense, so for example, if we were to say teach, or you were to say to me teach, then that is a command or a request. So we can do it as one word. Or we can say you teach the lesson, and again that's a request to be done or a command to be done. Or you might start with speaking to somebody, David, write the example, and of course they're in the second person singular or second person plural. So we're commanding either an individual or requesting an individual to do something, or we're commanding or requesting a group of people to do something. So that's the imperative. Now, the other moods, which we will consider over the time, is an infinitive, which is just the idea of a verb in general. Won't go into too much detail, which is to teach. Then there's participles, which are big in Greek, and they're the verbal adjective. So in the example there, while teaching, he sat down. So teaching is the participle. Whereas he sat is the verb within that sentence. So, but we'll talk more about that when we look at participles. And then there's a subjunctive, which is the way of expressing uncertainty. So I might teach, I may do something. So these are different moods, okay? And that's the kind of category. It's the word we use, and we categorize them according to this. And we're going to look at some imperatives, and I've given you some examples, so you probably don't need to necessarily go down any further. Mention that they're in the second person singular or plural. And in English, we just have one imperative, to express command, exhortation, request, and so on. In Greek, however, it's not quite simple because there are two ways. It gives us a little bit more flexibility, really, with it, which is what we'll look at now. So if we have a look at how Greek might express the imperative, so meaning a similar sort of thing, what we're going to find, though, is that in Greek, the imperative can be written in the present or the aorist tense. And first thing we kind of got to do is not just look at how it's formed, but also what it then means, because the meaning of the imperative is, also the meaning of the present tense or the aorist tense being used is going to have some difference in understanding. So that's something which we should pick up. But let's just have a look first of all at the formation of it. So we'll take our usual verb luo. All right, so we know luo means to untie or to loose, and what we do to form the imperative, we only want to look at the second person singular and the second person plural. And first of all, in the present tense, we've got luē, so the ending. You've got the stem and an ending, as is the case in the indicative as well. And for the second person plural, it's luete. Now I'm hoping that when you look at that, you think I've seen that word before, and you have, okay, because it's identical to the present indicative second person plural. It's the same. It's spelt exactly the same way, which means this, that when you come across a word, a second person plural in the present tense, it could mean the indicative or it could mean an imperative, and the context will determine which is going to be, and more of that will come out later. So you kind of usually will understand whether somebody is requesting something or whether somebody's just making a statement in the second person plural. Second person singular, it's different, so you can tell that. So the aorist also has a way of being able to express the imperative. So first of all, we'll just give the ending. So the aorist has this sigma, which we noticed was inserted into between the stem and the ending when we looked at the aorist tense when it was thinking about the past. And we had the sigma included, but you will also, I hope, remember that if you're talking about the aorist in the indicative, so if you're just thinking about the standard aorist tense, then there was an epsilon that was added to the front. There was this extra letter added to the front, as the same with the imperfect. So in the imperfect and aorist, there was an epsilon added. Now there's no epsilon added for the aorist here. And the reason for that is the prefix, which is the epsilon, which is added to the start of a word. So this prefix, that indicates past time. Okay, so that's why you get a prefix in front of the imperfect and in the aorist, because it's telling you that the action of the verb happened in the past. Because there's no epsilon in front of the aorist in the imperative, which might sound a bit confusing, that means it must be concentrating on some other kind of meaning behind it. And if you remember, I've just written up the second person plural ending, thought probably should put that up there. So this sigma is indicating that you've kind of got an aorist. Also, we've looked at verbs that have the future, which I know then there's some elements of confusion. So try to briefly say that the difference between the present and the aorist imperative is to do with aspect. Now, when we looked at the verbs in the indicative, we talked about aspect, we talked about the present tense and the imperfect tense, talking about an ongoing situation, something that was a process. So when we say in the imperfect, I was doing something, we're talking about something you were doing over a period of time. When we put it in the aorist, it was we just did something, and there was no indication as to whether it was continued, whether you did it once, whether you did it lots of times. It was undefined. So the same applies in the imperative, right? The present tense has a kind of keep on doing this, right? It's got that idea of a continuous process. Okay, the command is keep on doing, whereas the aorist is undefined. It may well say do it once. It may well not necessarily give any indications whether you're supposed to do it lots of times or whether you just have to do it once or not. So the aorist imperative is just a undefined aspect, which is therefore the tense, which is the default tense. Okay, it's the tense that you would use in the same way that in the past tense you use aorist as a default tense of just undefined kind of action, but obviously imperative. Now I'll give a bit of that sort of case when we go through a couple of examples, but it's important to try to start to distinguish between why we have two tenses that are used in the imperative, the present and the aorist. Also, we're going to need to try and remember that it doesn't have an epsilon at the front of it, and if it doesn't, then it's not referring to past time, so it must be in another mood. That's really how we think about it. Let's have a look at a couple of examples, just to sort of think about how we might translate it. In translation, you may well translate it in a simple sense, or may come across in that sense as being translated the same. But it's probably quite useful to get your sort of thinking around what it means to put a imperative in the present and in the aorist when you're translating. So if we look at a couple of examples, so enoigeton oikon. So here this is from the verb to open, so enoigo, and we're in the second person singular, and it's the present. So it's this is to open the house, and in that sense, kind of keep opening the house. All right, whatever the reason is, you do that. So open the house, and it's in the singular. And you might, as we often do, if you want to illustrate a command, we use an exclamation mark. So we tend to put that in there to give an indication that we are referring to some instruction, some command, however forceful that command might be. All right. And you could, of course, translate it, you open the house, but it gives better sense, I suppose, or better force if we just put open the house as we've got there. All right, and for graphete, so this is from grapho, which means to write. And so we have graphete, which of course is also the present indicative, isn't it? Okay, second person plural. But so it could be write the words, which is to slogus, so that's the plural of word. So write the words, and the context will determine whether we're going to translate that as an imperative or whether that's just a statement. Okay, and you would pick that up within any other writings. So for the moment, let's just treat it as an imperative. Write the words is what we would be looking for. Now, number 3, just to illustrate one other thing that we just need to pick up. You perhaps, I hope, remember that when you wanted to negate something, so you didn't want something to happen, in English, of course, we use not or no. So we use not, don't we? In Greek, we used ou, or depending on whether it ended, whether the verb or the word that followed started with a rough or smooth breathing, we used ook or ooks, really just for pronunciation. So these were not in the indicative. So we use those for an indicative tense. An indicative mood. For an imperative mood, we use may. Okay, so there is another set of words which are for the other moods. So this is for the indicative, we use ook, ooks, the other moods, other moods, we're going to use may, and then there are other words that go with it, but I'll leave it just there. So we have may here, which means don't do it, don't do this. So pemphon comes from pempo, and it has the sigma in it, so it's an aorist here. And if you remember the change from the pi, which goes to the psi, so this means do not send. Okay, so because of this bit of negation here, so do not. So it's not really, isn't it? So, but we want to do it as a command. So do not send. Do not send. So we've got Tain and Delphine. Oops, that should be a slip on my keyboard. A Delphine. So do not send the sister. Right, so that's just how we would negate in a command, so not to do something rather than to do something. Just need to look out for may there and not u. And that also might help you, particularly if the statement is in a negative, you'll know whether it's indicative or whether it's an imperative. So that may be of some help. And then just finally, which is the fourth one here, ete sate ton kyrion. So this is the verb to ask, and it's one of the epsilon omega verbs. So they have the same kind of ending when it's in the aorist as we talked about before. Okay, so the lengthening of the e to eta, the epsilon to eta, the inclusion of the sigma, and then it has its own ending. So we've got our aorist ending here, lusate, and here etesate. So this is ask. So ask the Lord. Oops, ask the Lord. Right. If you want, you can turn them into commands. So it leaves me just with one little bit to say, which is quite a little bit. It's quite a bit of information here, really, which is what happens with the present imperative with the epsilon omega verbs. And that is exactly the same as you have seen when we looked at the indicative. So we used philo, if you remember. Okay, so where there were certain lengthenings of words because of this epsilon that kind of pops in, then if you remember for the second person plural is going to be so philae is the word for so if you remember, we had philae and then we had philate. Okay, all right, so here we have obviously we don't need the epsilon ending, so we've got philae and philete. Okay, I know we do have, so we add an extra iota here, which is slightly different, and then just for the aorist, so you've got it, philason is what we've got, and then philasate. All right, so those are kind of what happens in the epsilon omega verbs, just so you've kind of got their endings, and that kind of gives us enough perhaps to try and at least do some translation, I think, which we'll have a go at now, which is a few words here. So you might want to use the vocab from chapter 6. So I've used those verbs in most cases. Hopefully they're all written out in the right way, just to give a bit of translation. And so I'll stop the recording now and we'll see if we can do some of those, and then we'll pick up some in a minute. Okay.